President Biden has issued some of his sharpest criticism yet of Israel's military campaign in Gaza. It comes after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called Hamas's proposed terms for a ceasefire, quote, delusional, and vowed to fight on.
The conduct of the response in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, has been over the top. I'm pushing very hard now to deal with this hostage ceasefire, because I've been working tirelessly in this deal. How can I say this without revealing it? To lead to a sustained pause in the fighting, in the actions taking place in the Gaza Strip.
All right, so for more on this, we're joined by CBS News contributor Samantha Vinograd. She is a former assistant secretary for counterterrorism at the Department of Homeland Security. What did you make of the president's comments? He sort of has a way at times of speaking in a very casual way that leaves it open to interpretation, but the words were pretty strong.
Certainly. I think two things can be true. It can be true that the administration and so many of us are horrified by Hamas's brutal terrorist attack against Israel. And at the same time, there is consensus within the administration that Netanyahu's response to that horrific attack by Hamas, the taking of hostages, the murder of children and women and unarmed civilians, has been disproportionate. And ultimately, that the Israeli government's response in Gaza could backfire when it comes to two key objectives, namely the return of the hostages, and second, not creating a situation on the ground that is going to lead to more conflict against Israel and in the region more broadly.
So, as you know, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is back in Washington. This is his fifth trip to the Middle East since October 7th. No deal was reached. I wonder, Samantha, in this era of Blinken's shuttle diplomacy, is he gaining any traction? Because we find ourselves sort of redoing this every time he comes back from the trip. I had some very good meetings, some positive meetings, but there are no positive outcomes on the Gaza Strip.
Well, not yet. And unfortunately, the negotiations are proceeding apace, just not on the timeline that any of us are hoping for. Having been a part of secret negotiations, overt negotiations, they do take time. Both sides are going to start with extreme positions that are mutually unacceptable. And ultimately, the goal is to arrive, of course, at a consensus position. Time is just not on our side here. Every minute that goes by, another hostage's health is increasingly at risk. Every minute that goes by, another child in Gaza is without food or exposed to perhaps a barrage from the Israeli military. And there's that horrific humanitarian and human aspect of it, but there's also the fact that the longer that this goes on, both the leadership in Hamas and the leadership in Israel are facing internal domestic pressures not to make a deal. The right wing in Israel is very much against Bibi Netanyahu negotiating. And within Hamas, there is inordinate pressure as more civilians die, for example, to say that Hamas needs to walk away from the negotiating table because what the Israeli government is doing. So I am confident that the negotiations are proceeding. It's just unclear what the costs are going to be the longer the negotiations take.
You talked about the conflict possibly sort of leading to other conflicts beyond in the region. The Secretary of State, as usual, hopscotched through several countries, including Saudi Arabia. And part of what he's also talking about is what happens next once the conflict is resolved. Can you talk about the role that Saudi Arabia is playing, why it is important that that they remain engaged in this conversation?
Sure. I mean, Saudi Arabia in this particular context is a bit of a kingmaker. Mohammed bin Salman had been in talks with the United States to normalize relations with Israel prior to the conflict erupting. Now, part of that would have been an irrefutable path to statehood for the Palestinian Authority. Saudi Arabia, therefore, is key to getting both Israel and the Palestinian Authority to negotiate, and the Hamas and the Palestinian Authority to negotiate in a meaningful way. At the same time, don't forget, Saudi Arabia recently re-engaged in relations with Iran in 2023. Because of that, Saudi Arabia has, to a large degree, economic leverage over the Iranian regime. And Iran is really pulling the strings when it comes to the actions of Hamas, the action of the Houthis in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, and other proxies in the Middle East that are regionally involved in this conflict. So Saudi Arabia is in a key position to help not just bring tensions down, but also try to bring parties to a negotiated outcome.
Samantha, really quickly before I ask you the last question, would the region benefit from Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, stepping down and letting other leaders sort of take the ball and try to get to a negotiated settlement here?
Well, it's clear that Bibi Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas have been unable to negotiate a two-state solution that is in the best interest of their people. So I am hopeful for the security of the region that there's leadership that is able to be representative of what their people want and able to negotiate in a meaningful way.
All right, so last question is, there have been continued strikes, self-defense strikes that the United States says against what has been happening in the Red Sea against Houthi rebels. It doesn't seem like these strikes are having any, are they having an impact? Because it feels as if they are still continuing to attack shipping lanes and U.S. interests.
Well, to date, it does appear that the coalition has not been successful in degrading the Houthis' offensive capability. And that is because this is not really a military issue, Vlad. This is an intelligence issue. We need intelligence on where these weapons are coming from, how they're being supplied to the Yemenis, what are the transit routes, so we can stop these weapons, which are unto themselves relatively small, from actually getting into Houthi hands. That intelligence analysis of where the weapons are coming from and how is going to be key to actually degrading the Yemenis' offensive capabilities and ultimately convincing the Iranian regime to stop supplying them.
Wow. Samantha Vinograd, I always feel smarter after you stop by. It's nice to have you on set.